Okay, there's a bit of a lag here, so I'll get started because you'll see this about 1 minute later. My name is Tableau Tim, or Tim. I'm from the Information Lab, and this is the first of 4 live streams we're doing on the new Tableau 2020.2 release. Today's live stream is going to be looking at the data model and relationships, essentially a new concept that's been launched recently in the product. Just to give you an overview of how this live stream is going to work, it's going to run for roughly 40 minutes. And what I'll do is at the end of that, I'll probably take questions as they come through on the chat. By all means, just post the questions as and when, and I'll try and get through them during the live stream, if that's relevant. Otherwise, I'll save them to the end. I might answer your question up front, so just maybe wait as well to see if that happens. I'll do an overview of the feature first. I'll sort of just dive right in. I know people sometimes don't have a lot of time, so the first 15 minutes, I'll just dive straight into the feature capability. And then we'll kind of step back out, look at a deep dive of the product and the feature and how it all works. Then we'll build out a small example that I've borrowed from the beta process that was just closed before 2020.2 released. Okay, that's the rough overview of how the stream is going to work. Again, if you've got any questions, just drop a question in the comments. I can already see a few questions coming in. If you want access to things like the workbook, the data source, what you should do is you should come back to this video once it's live on YouTube, and in the description, I'll have a link so you can download the content and follow along if you want to. Otherwise, just watch this live stream and pretty much enjoy the session. Okay, I'm actually going to leave PowerPoint straight away because I don't like to use PowerPoint too much. First thing I wanted to do is just let you know, so we've got some upcoming events. This is the first of 4 events. Today is on relationships. This kind of warranted its own live stream, as it were. Next week, we're going to actually be doing a more sort of broad feature roundup of everything new in Tableau Desktop. But you can also see here we have other events available that you can sign up to. They're all online and free given the current situation with the pandemic. So sign up to those, get involved, and there's lots of great content coming up over the next month. Now, the other thing I wanted to do is just call out some of the sources where I've got lots of my information from. I kind of get the sense that this has caught a lot of the community sort of off guard because there's a big change to sort of our habitual behavior and how we use the product in the past. So one of the best ways you can find out about these features upfront is just to join the Tableau pre-release program. Okay, this allows you to essentially just try the features. This feature has actually been available to try out since November of last year. And there's several betas running at any one time. There's the early feedback, there's the developer program, which allows you to test things like APIs. There's a Tableau mobile beta, which lets you test mobile functionality. And there's a couple of other sort of interesting, maybe product-specific betas around other platforms as well. But generally, if you get involved with the betas, you'll get access to the pre-release platform. It kind of looks like this. This is my pre-release platform. I'm all logged in. So you can see here the 2020.2 beta is already closed, but the 2020.3 beta is already on its way. So as soon as one closes, the next one comes up. Okay. A few other bits of content. If you have a chance, by all means, make sure you watch Bethany Lyon's talk from the Tableau conference last year in November. This is about a 1-hour video. You can watch it on YouTube. I'll put a link in the description of this video once it's up. But it's a really, really good video for setting the context behind what's changed and how things are going to change in terms of working with the product going forward. But it also kind of starts to hint about where Tableau is going with this feature. I think this is the first iteration of this feature, and I would expect them to improve a lot of capability. And then the last thing to look out for is the documentation. I know documentation is typically a boring thing, but it's actually really, really good, especially on the Tableau sort of knowledge base here, where they go through lots and lots of very detailed explanations of how things have changed, where to expect sort of issues and challenges if you're used to working with other products or if you're used to working with Tableau. Also gives you some context as to what's supported and what's not supported with this new data model. And they've got this great FAQ, which I'll actually borrow a few notes from when I'm going through this webinar. And it basically just walks through all the different scenarios about questions you might have or things you might notice. It's a really good place to come to straight away to make sure that you get your questions answered nice and fast, and it's always available. It's much faster than contacting support. as well. So definitely check out those resources. I'll make sure I put them all in the description of this video once it's up. But without further ado, I think I've shown you enough of the internet. Let's get stuck in with 2020.2. Now, let me just make sure that I am in 2020.2. I have several versions of Tableau. So yeah, you can see that I'm on 2020.2, okay? And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to an Excel file. This Excel file is essentially called the Beta Bookshop. So let's just open this up. I've got a folder here with all my 2020.2 data sources. I'm going to hit open. And as I do that, you'll see that the first thing you'll notice once this opens is that this interface is ever so slightly different, okay? I'll just call out a few things. You'll see that this icon here is a slightly new concept here. It's a much cleaner icon. But as I drag a table in, as you would have done before, you'll notice that nothing's that different apart from, you'll see that this book table here has a new box around it. And you have this new hint to kind of call out the fact that things from here on are going to be different. And so the first thing to point out is that relationships are the default form of connecting to data, okay? So I'll cover a little bit about how joins, unions, and blends work in 2020.2 a little later on. But it's important to know that when you connect to any data set and you start dragging things in, the default interface is going to be for relationships, okay? So I've got this data set which has information about books. I can preview any of these tables. So let's say I wanted to bring in information about the book itself. I've got this info table here. If I click on this view data icon, you can see that I can still see this as normal. Nothing's changed here. It's exactly the same. However, if I come in to drag this into the view, you'll notice that I get this new sort of interface, which has this little link, which has been affectionately called the noodle. Okay, so you can wave it around and kind of push it to its limits. It's kind of addictive the first time you try it, and then it gets kind of boring very quickly. And when I drop this into the view, you get this new interface for relationships, okay? And it's an important thing to think about almost straight away, because in most cases, in pretty much every single case, you just quickly connect to something in Tableau and start working with it. This interface is going to work just as you'd expect, okay? So you can see here that I've defined a relationship between the book table and the info table, and it's using the book ID as a way of relating these two things, okay? And I have a few options here. What I always say with these is, and Tableau actually advises as well, is don't change these unless you understand specifically how cardinality and referential integrity changes the way your data behaves, okay? It's a pretty bold thing to try and change if you don't understand it. So just try and leave the defaults as they are. Again, in most cases, this should be intuitive and it should just work. But if you start to get into issues or you're troubleshooting, the Tableau documentation will tell you where these particular issues are going to come up. So don't worry too much about them initially. It should just make things a lot simpler, okay? Now, the other thing you might ask is, well, can I still join and can I still do things like unions? Well, the answer is yes, absolutely you can. Let's just close this and remove this information icon from this sort of view. I'm just going to remove it. It's the third option here. And you'll see it just goes back to how it was before. In order to join this information to this table, what I actually have to do is I have to go into the book table, okay? And by doing that, I just click open, okay? And so you get this old interface that we're used to. You have a book in blue here on the left-hand side. And then now if I drag the information icon in, you'll notice that it just uses the traditional join, okay? So this is almost the first meaningful difference to 2020.1 and anything that came before, because it introduces essentially two levels, okay? This level we're looking at is called the physical layer. And if I just go back one, this level here is called the logical layer. So every relationship we define is essentially a relationship between two or more logical tables. And anything we define inside of a table in here is being defined at the physical layer. And the best way to think of that is the physical layer is literally taking each row and matching it to another row in the table, okay? Whereas in the logical layer, you're not actually doing that. What you're doing is you're waiting until the visualization is being generated to see what the best level of aggregation works. And then from there, figuring out how to bring the data together. And Tableau does that all automatically, okay? I'll go into that in a bit more detail. So let's just investigate this join a little bit. I'm going to do a left join. Essentially, I only want information about the books that I actually got in my data set. I'm not too worried about information for books that I don't have. So let's just do a left join here. And I'm going to go ahead and actually bring in another piece of information. This is going to be about awards. In this particular case, this again relates to books. So let's just have a look at this. And you can see that it's going to be linked using the title column. I know this data set well, so I'm pretty familiar with it. But you can see here the title in the book table and the title in this award table is the same. So I can bring that in as well. Okay, so let's just bring that in. And again, I'll do a left join, so I'm only bringing in the awards I'm actually interested in. Okay, so here we are. We've made joins between 3 tables, and we're doing this at the physical layer. Okay, if I close this, you'll notice that you get this icon to let you know that you've actually created a join at this level of analysis. Okay, and then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to now create another relationship, this time at the logical layer. Okay, so I'm going to bring the author out onto the view. And once I've done that, I also obviously get the interface again. I'm going to leave this as is. One thing to call out is that you can add more fields. Let's say you have multiple fields that are required in a relationship. You can just go ahead and add more. It's a pretty intuitive thing to do. But in this case, we only need the one. So I'm just going to close that and leave it as it is. I'm going to hit close. And the last thing to point out here is that typically, when you work with a data set and you do a join, you're actually used to seeing every single column being used in the data set. And you'll notice here that I'm only seeing the information about the author. Well, that's because I've got the author table highlighted here. In fact, if I actually click on the book table, you'll see that I do get every single column, including the ones that I joined from my data set in that physical join in the physical layer. But I only get to see the information from each individual sort of logical table. I don't see like a combined view. And the reason that is because Tableau doesn't yet know at what level of detail it's going to combine these 2 data sets in order for them to work in the visualization. Okay. Now you can see we've got a couple other fields, but for now I'm just going to keep this simple, and we're going to hop into the view to just start seeing how this has changed how we work with visualizations. Okay. So immediately when I hop in to my data set, you'll see that this interface here on the left-hand side is slightly different. The first thing I think a lot of people notice is that dimensions and measures seems to have disappeared. Well, I'd actually argue they haven't disappeared. They've changed the presentation of how it's shown to the user. And I think in some cases it's better, but in other cases it's definitely a little bit more frustrating. I can give you an example. So here, if I just start to drag hours writing per day, you'll see here that if I just zoom in, I get that little call out for dimensions and measures. Okay, so they haven't disappeared. It's just highlighted differently using this very real subtle line here. You can just see it there. It's very faint. And that's now available as a way of differentiating between measures and dimensions within each logical table. That's the key thing here. Each logical table has its own sort of differentiator of dimensions and measures. The next thing to note is that you also get a third sort of area down here. You get another line here, okay? Measure names, latitude, longitude generated, and measure values. And anything that's created, any calculation that's created that uses facts from both logical tables ends up in this bottom layer, okay? So you've essentially got 2 spaces. You've got a space for each of the logical tables and their own dimensions and measures. And then again, you've got a space for measures or calculations that have been created from both logical tables or multiple logical tables here at the bottom. The next thing you might notice is that number of records isn't here, okay? You'll see that there's no number of records. Instead, it's been replaced by this item here called count. And it's actually exactly the same thing. If I can explain this a little bit more. In the previous setup with logical, with physical layers or with joins, essentially what the number of records was doing was just adding up the number of rows. And it was just essentially a calculation like so. If I just create a simple calculation here, my calculation window has gone off screen. So let me bring that in. Let's just create the number 1. I'm just going to arbitrarily call this number of records. Okay, click OK. That's basically what's missing. It's just a calculation that sums up the number of rows. But the reason this doesn't quite work in this setup is because depending on the view and depending on the detail, i.e. the dimensions and the level of detail that you've got in the view, that actually changes because it changes what you're counting, because the aggregation each time is different, okay? So it's a really important concept to be aware of. Now, the next question might then be, well, what happens if I open an old workbook with number of records, okay? What happens with old workbooks, full stop? So let's go ahead and open one. I've actually got an old workbook that I can show you if I just zoom back out. I'm going to go ahead and open a very, very old workbook. I had to download this from Tableau Public. And it's the step line example here. I downloaded it in version 2019.1, but I think it was actually built in an older version. But this workbook itself has been downloaded in 2019.1. Of course, it's opened it in another window, so let me drag it in. And if I just sort of get this to fill the screen, just 1 second, there we go. You'll notice that it just goes straight into the view. It doesn't sort of give you any prompt about any challenges with opening it. So that's something to bear in mind. It will just essentially work. I'll go to one of the sheets that I had in here, and you'll notice that number of records is actually there. You can see that it's been left in there. And all that's happened is that the calculation has been left available to you. The other thing is, when we go to edit the data source, you'll notice this data source wasn't created in 2020.2. And the way you know that, if I just reconnect to the CSV, is that you'll see this migrated data table here. So this is what happens with any workbook that's opened in 2020.2 that wasn't created in 2020.2. It's a really important thing to be aware of. You can then, of course, fix this very quickly. Let me just connect to the CSV. I've got that here. Of course, it takes me to the temp folder. I'll connect to the CSV here, click open. And now you can see this is working fine. Okay, so this is a very sort of important thing to be aware of. Just in the first couple of days, we have noticed that in some cases, where number of records is being used in slightly sort of peculiar situations, when you open it in 2020.2, you do sometimes get an issue where Tableau almost forgets what was what the field was doing. And so things like filters based on number of records, you might have to go in and reset them. So it's definitely something to be aware of, and just make sure you check a workbook when you open it in 2020.2 for the first time. Maybe set up a test script in 2020.1 first, or in a previous version before publishing it up in 2020.2. So that's essentially what happened. You just get this migrated data table available to you. So I'll go ahead and close that. Okay, so we're in our view, and we've got a sort of a series of items here. Now, what I'm going to do is very sort of deliberately create a few calculations. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to see if there's anything, any correlation, let's say, between the number of hours writing per day and the number of books. Okay, so let's just say average hours writing per day. Divided by, this calculation probably makes no sense, but I just want to highlight something, so by the number of books. Now, you'll see here that the average of count of book doesn't actually make sense because it's already in aggregation. So it will actually give you a warning, and that's fine. Hours writing per day isn't the same as the count here, so that's why that's working. So I'll just call this a new calculation. If I can type properly. Click OK. And you'll see that this appears here on the bottom hand side pane. So it appears in our neutral space for new calculations because it's using measures that have been created from both logical tables. If, however, I just create a very simple calculation, which is essentially just the average of hours writing per day, and I can call this average hours writing per day. Hit apply. Interestingly, this has gone here. This is not what I was expecting to happen. If you bear with me 1 second, let's try something different. hours writing per day. Divided, let's just do a straight division between these two tables. Okay, let's try that. No, that goes to the same place. Okay. I've probably missed an important key here somewhere, but essentially any calculation that's created that only references one of the logical tables will have that calculation appear in that logical table. That's sort of the expected behavior. And then anything that references both logical tables will appear here in the neutral space. Okay, that's an important thing to be aware of. I can't quite immediately explain why this is happening. It'll probably come to me later on, or I maybe answer it again at the end when we look at questions. Now, the next thing to bear in mind is when you look at your data, when you look at the view of data, you don't get a single table showing you your combined data set in its relationships. You get separate views, okay? So you don't, whenever you export the data, whenever you try and look at the detailed data view, you don't always get a single view. And that's, again, because these two data sets are coming in as two separate items. Tableau is dynamically aggregating it and basically building a view on the fly. Okay, so if we just basically build a very, very basic view, I'll just say, let's look at the authors. If we just get an author ID in this particular case, and then get their first name and their last name, so we can see who they are. And then we just see how many books they've each written. And then we sort this, you'll see something very interesting, okay? Previously, if I'd joined my authors to my books and I'd done a left join, what would have happened is I would have, unless I did something like a full outer join or something a little bit more abstruse, I wouldn't have lost the authors that hadn't written any books. Whereas in this particular setup, Tableau is automatically bringing in the authors who have no books to their name. And so this is really useful when you think about analysis for things like opportunities and leads, if you're coming from the Salesforce world or if you're coming from a sales world, because you typically only have information about leads that are in progress, but opportunities don't necessarily always have the information and context required. And so typically, if you used joins, you'd typically use entire sort of subsets of your data that you wouldn't have in context or in view. This is something to be aware of, and it's kind of a great opportunity in terms of analytics, because you now have an increased sort of overview of what's going on in your data. And the best thing here is you're doing it all with one connection. You're not creating sort of multiple views. Now, at this point, it's probably worth just jumping into sort of the meaningful differences between joins, unions, blends, and how this all relates to relationships. So I'm going to hop back into PowerPoint here to just go through that in a little bit more detail. Let's pull up PowerPoint. Okay. So if I just go full screen here, you'll see here that this is a diagram by Tableau. It's basically describing the difference between the logical and the physical layer. And everything in green here is essentially what we had available to us before. And the logical layer is sort of an extension of our existing capability to a new level. Now, if we go forward a little bit, you'll notice a couple of things. Previously, what used to happen is unions allowed us to sort of stack data above each other. So a union is basically when you need to get two data sets, maybe you have Q1, Q2, Q3, and you basically stack them on top of each other or append them in database terms to each other. And then you have one new table, which is just essentially a taller table. Okay, that's a pretty common capability. We've had that for quite some time in Tableau. The next sort of setup was joins, and there's two types of joins. The first one is a row level join. This is what we did in the book data set. We basically joined the information to the books, and then we were able to do some very basic analysis, and you saw one physical table sort of generated from that, and it sort of represented our main logical table that we used. And then authors was a second logical table, which isn't represented here at all. Okay. The other type of join you'll get is an aggregated join. And essentially here, what you're doing is you're taking one data set, typically your primary data set. You're used to the term primary and secondary tables when you're doing blends. Your primary data set is pretty much driving the analysis and the level of detail required. And then your secondary data set is typically not at the same level of detail, but gets aggregated to a specific level where you can then form a relationship between the two and then do a join. So essentially what happens with the blend is you're aggregating one data set to the appropriate level, then you're joining it to your primary data set to create a new perspective, okay? And it has a few quirks with it. It only ever results in a left join as a starter. So anything that doesn't match always gets left out. That's something I highlighted with relationships that can do. And then the other thing is that for each view, you have to specify the blend. You have to specify the blend relationship. So every single view has to have a different articulation of how it works in the whole sort of setup. And so this leads to some pains. Essentially, in complex scenarios, it can lead to things like multiple connections aggregated at different levels and then blended back into a primary data set. So this happens a lot in fast-moving consumer goods when you've got a local level, a country level, you've got regional level, then you've got global level of analysis, and then you have to essentially blend all of that back into a primary data set. You might end up with joins that cause the data to explode. So in this particular case, you might know that if I join these opportunities, for example, to this one manager, well, it's going to explode some information on the manager table, right? But then in today's world, we fix that with a level of detail calculation. I don't know what we did before LODs existed, but that's typically something that we've done in the past, okay? And then this would sometimes lead to a scenario where you had really, really tall, large data sets that could, in some cases, cause performance issues. The other sort of pain here is you'd end up with multiple connections for different perspectives. So again, working on sort of complex questions, especially when you're dealing with relationships in the real world, let's say doctor patients or managers and their teams and so on and so forth, and budgets in different departments and how they all come together, you end up having to create multiple connections that are fixed at the level or the perspective that you want to do. Okay, and so that's another thing. You open a workbook, you maybe have 4 connections. It's really not that helpful. Again, with the blends, highlighted this already, each view had its own relationship. So every single time you open a sheet, you have to define that relationship, and that became a little bit tedious. The other bigger issue with blends is you actually can't publish a blend for other people to use on Tableau server. Okay, so if you think about the way a blend works, you have to have 2 separate data sets, but you can't necessarily publish that relationship to Tableau server for others to use. So that typically only sort of allowed it to work in the setup of it being embedded in a Tableau workbook. You couldn't necessarily publish that up just as its own data source for other people to use. You'd have to publish 2 separate data sources. Then the author would have to connect to those 2 data sources and define the blend relationship themselves. Okay. A big one here is you lose any unmatched rows. That's pretty obvious with the way joins work. And then with all the above, you have sort of performance issues where you're either querying multiple data sets. If you do a performance recording on some really nasty, big multi-connection workbooks, you can see sort of the impact it has on the workbook, but also sometimes on the database if you're dealing with very large data sets and you can't possibly create an extract. So it led to some undesirable performance and heavy workbooks in some cases. Okay, and so if I just hop back out, what we're going to do now is we're going to build out something that tries to sort of start to see how you can resolve all of these using relationships. And again, for this, I'm going to be using this model. This is actually from the beta process itself. For anyone who wants this, or anyone who's joined late on and didn't catch it at the beginning, I'll post the link to everything I'm using in this live stream in the description of this video once it's available on YouTube. So just head to this video. You can just bookmark this link, actually. It will come up under the same link and you'll be able to access everything that I'm doing. But this describes a very basic data model for this book data set that we're working with. And you'll see here earlier on, we created this book join here. So you can see I've got this join icon here. We created this setup here, but what we're now going to do is we're going to create some of these other setups, okay? And we're going to see how that looks inside of Tableau. And I'm just going to go through the process of doing it in real time so you can see how that works. And I'm just going to carry on from where I left in the existing workbooks. So I'm just going to edit this data source. I'm going to hop back in. And you can see here that we've already joined these two tables to this book table. And if I went back too far there, I need to go back to edit this. The way to get out of this physical layer, I'm still sort of not got the muscle memory for it, is to hit the X button, not the back button. I can't just unlearn that behavior. So it's just something to be aware of, okay? So we've got the author in here already. The next bit of information we need to grab is the books, the edition even. And the edition, when we drop this in, you'll see that it creates a new noodle and joins those two data sets. And as we just drop it in, you'll see that it asks for a little help, because in this particular case, it wasn't able to just make sense of which book ID I wanted to use. I've got a couple here from the joins that I did inside of this book table, but it's not sure which of those to use for this edition. So I'm going to help it a little bit by just selecting those two. Once I do that, you'll see that I get the preview for the edition below. I'll hit close, and then I'll hit cross. And then now that's pretty much good to go. And so you can just keep doing this, but I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to bring in publisher, and notice what happens here. So I'm dragging it here, and as I move across, it actually connects to the second table here. And this is important because this is where I can define the relationship. My publisher table doesn't have any information relating to the book. It has information relating to the edition, okay? So when I drop this in here, the thing I'm looking for is a relationship on publisher ID. You can just see that there very clearly, okay? So now that's available to me, that's great. I'm just going to leave that there. Now, the thing is, I've got sales, and if I just look at this preview here, you'll see that I've got, sales for Q1. If I look at Q2, it's pretty much exactly the same columns, no surprise there, and it pretty much just lists the sales for each quarter. But I'd like to bring this as a union. I've got 4 sets of data here, and I'd like to bring it in as a union. So I can do that in 2 ways. I can actually drag in a new union here. I need to define where that union is going to go. So I have to have some sort of preconception of this up front. And as I drop this in, I'll get this interface to allow me to union the data set. And so I'm just going to select cells Q1 to Q4 and drag them in to this setup, and you'll see that that just goes in. Click OK, and only after I've clicked OK for the union will I then get the interface asking me how to make the relationship, okay? And so now I get the relationship interface, and I'm now able to do that. And you also get this icon here that shows you that this is a union, okay? So that's just something to be aware of. I'll click close because that relationship's correct. There's a few bugs here. If you see any sort of artifacts on the screen, it's just I think it's just a little bit buggy. So that's pretty much a union of all the sales data in one place, okay? Now, the last thing I need to do is add a few more bits of information. So checkouts, I can do this very quickly now. Tableau should pick up the book ID. In each case, it didn't. So I think it's just not understanding which of these to use. So let's just go ahead and do that. And let's see, what else have I got here? Ratings. Let's just add that in. Let's get to book ID, ratings, yeah. And then the last thing I need to add is the series. I need to just drop that in here. You can see it's wanting to do a union there if I just drop it there. So that's the other way you can do a union of a data set. You can literally just drop items in and it will just figure it out, okay? And this actually comes from my book data. Now you'll notice that this, if I just click close on this, my book data didn't necessarily have the series information, okay? That actually came from one of my joins, okay? So it's important to bear in mind that if you want to make a relationship on something that isn't in your sort of main data set, the way to do that is to do a left join in with your main data set. Then you have that available to you to use in your relationship, okay? So this is almost the full data model here that we set out to build. I'll just bring another version of it here on screen so you can kind of see them side by side. So you can see here that we've basically joined cells data together. We've got the author, we've got the series, checkouts, ratings, editions, publishers, mostly using book ID, but a few exceptions using series and publisher ID, okay? So now if we go back into the view, you'll see, well, for starters, all of that work hasn't impacted the visualization that I built. You know, the aggregation and the counting is still correct. You can imagine a world where you blended something, you changed something in the data set, and now you've got to go and do some funny LODs and sort of correct it all. In this world, that doesn't happen. And I'm still just using one connection to bring all of these data sources together. Okay. The other thing is that this has gotten very long. And so you remember earlier on, I told you it might get annoying when you don't have dimensions and measures. That's fundamentally because if you come out of this table view and you sort of group by folder, you just get one really long list. And this line is really hard to notice. So it is just there, but if it's a really tall sort of data set with lots of fields, then it's really hard to actually see that differentiation. So I'd actually like the ability to see the classic view in this setup. I know it kind of doesn't make sense with the data model, but the classic view would be something that would be useful in this particular case. But this is how it looks now that you've brought everything in. So I'll go back to grouping this by the data source table. Okay, and so I probably just want to answer a few more questions. Okay, let's just answer a few things. So which books have the most editions? Okay, so the best way to do this is I can just grab the title of the book. The great thing is here, whatever I drag in, Tableau automatically figures out the correct level of detail and the way to aggregate everything. So the way I ask questions is actually now a little bit more intuitive as well. I don't have to go and grab the book ID like a DBA admin would. I can just go and grab the title. And all the information related to that title gets pulled in from my data model in the correct form. And so I can actually just build visualizations in the way that, you know, a typical person would ask a question, which is a real sort of plus. Okay, so which book has the most editions? For this, I can just grab the edition count because this is just counting the number of editions. So if I just drag that in, and then I can aggregate this, you'll see here that I can't even read that. If anyone can describe this, knows how to say this in the chat, please let me know how to say that. I'm not even going to try it on stream here. I'll probably just embarrass myself. This might not even be real books. It might just be a dummy data set. But that's a very simple question. And again, I'm not having to do any strenuous work here to do weird counts across different data sets or weird aggregations. It's just figuring it out at the correct level. I'll go to the next question I want to answer. Which books have no cells? Okay, so again, I can just grab title. And in this particular case, I can actually just look at the sales table. Now, the sales table here is actually just this union here. So it's called this union. And the thing to note about unions is if you've ever used unions in the traditional version of Tableau, what it does is it brings in the table name, which tells you which of the files in the union is actually generating that data. So I can actually just bring that here. You'll see that it's highlighted there. So table name is there. If I just put that next to the title, you can actually see that each of the books actually have some sales information across all the different quarters. So I could even use that as sort of a quarter sort of data analysis if I wanted to, but I don't need to use that in this particular case. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring a count, and this is essentially counting at the level of that table. So if I just bring that in, you see that it's correctly aggregating the number of cells in this data set. Again, it's the most popular books. It's got lots of editions. It would make sense. But you can see here that I've got 3 titles with no cells. You see, that's also coming through. So you're not losing this in your analysis. You're not losing this perspective where because of the type of question you want to answer, you're losing the information about the books. Everything is kept in context, which is really, really, really valuable. Okay. And then the last one is which authors have no books. Okay. So this time I'm starting my analysis with the author table. So I'll bring out first name, last name. I'm not going to use author ID because you wouldn't ask a question that way. I could actually do the right thing here and just create a calculated field. So let's just open this up, hold Control or Command on the Mac to bring those two together, hit plus, and then hit plus again. So that basically means I'm concatenating the field by doing this, and I'll call this author name. And hit apply. Okay, so this actually did do what I was expecting to do now. So it must be to do with aggregations. Maybe I haven't fully understood that properly, but you can see here that this dimension has actually been created in the logical table that it came from because it's only using items from that specific logical table. So this is what I was trying to show earlier on, but I think because of the way I was building the calculation, the aggregation typically sits outside of it sits in this neutral zone and down here, which is what a few people are starting to call this. But anyway, let's bring in the author name onto the view. Let's drag out last name and first name. And then the question here is, which authors have no books? So essentially, I can just go into my books table and I can just count the number of books. And I can sort this in descending order. And then we have our authors who have no books. Okay. Now, this is a really sort of exciting thing, because you notice here that, some of these questions, I would have definitely have had to have changed the way I related the data or changed the way that all of this comes together. But I didn't have to do that. And the other thing is I have all my data available to me here. I can pretty much start asking a question at any level of detail. Maybe I want to analyze just sales. I don't need to create any new view. I can just start analyzing my sales data. And the beautiful thing here is that each view, each of these tabs here creates its own query. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to show you something in performance recording. If you've never done this before, it's a really useful way of understanding what Tableau is doing in the background. Essentially, performance recording switches on a feature where it analyzes the SQL queries that Tableau is generating behind the scene. And if I just start the performance recording, and what I'll do in this case is I'll just drag a few items out from each particular view. That instinctively runs a query in the background. If I maybe bring in a bit of information here, let's say this title, let's find out which publishing house is actually behind these titles, and I'll just bring that in front of the title. I don't have to worry too much about what's going on in there. I'll go back to this third view. Maybe I'll find out the sales for each edition in this particular case. And then I'll go back to help and I'll hit stop performance recording. And what this does is it actually creates a new workbook with a performance recording for this particular workbook. It's actually firing it up off screen here. So let me just bring that back in. Okay, so here we are. We're inside of the performance recording. Oh gosh, I've just flipped it back to the wrong screen again. Let me bring it back in here. So I kind of just want to make this smaller so you can see it, the whole entire workbook in this stream here. So here we are. We're in the workbook. I'm going to sort of slide the slider all the way down because it's a fairly performant workbook. It's not a complex data set. And if I just scroll down to one of these green ones, you see the green ones specifically relate to executing the query. And when you click on that, you actually get to see the query behind that particular setup. So, if I just make this fit the entire view, you can see how Tableau is actually working behind the scenes to build that query. And essentially, if you're connected to a real life database, you can essentially take this query and actually just run it on your database, and you should get a table that represents the same bit of information that's driving your visualization. So it's a really interesting way to start to see if Tableau is doing things efficiently, if there's any particular calculations that are causing you sort of weird behavior in the database or here in Tableau itself. And it's another nice way to start to see how Tableau is actually looking at these different tables and creating information about them. You can see here it's dynamically figuring out how to do the joins on various data sets, pulling in things at the right level of detail, and building that view for us without us having to do too much, if any, work at all. Okay. And then you get this sort of nice performance view as well, which sort of shows you when things happened throughout the sort of period you were running this. So it's measured in very small increments of time, but essentially this is the start, this is the finish, and you get a breakdown of when everything's happening. So it's a really nice way of sort of understanding not just what's happening here with the data model, but more broadly with everything else. Okay. I'm going to take a short break now just to look at some of the questions we've had in the stream. I can see we've had quite a few. So let me just go through these one by one. I'll stop sharing my screen, and then what I'll do is I'll share it again when I'm answering a specific question. So let's stop sharing, and I think you should see my video here. So if I just look at this, where can I find the beta workbook dataset? That will be available in the description below. Hello from Seattle. This is Dimitri. Any insights if in future the result of an LOD calculation will be able to use to connect relationships to another table? That's a very good question. So at the moment, if I actually open up, if I start sharing my screen again, I shouldn't stop sharing. I should just keep it as is. Microsoft wants to update Microsoft right now. It's not a good sign. Okay, let's share. I really nearly clicked the leave button there. I don't know if anyone noticed that. So let's bring Tableau back in. If I go back into my data set, this question about using an LOD, you can't use join calculations when defining relationships. So if I click on any one of these lines, you'll notice that you can't just use a join relationship to define what happens at this level. It has to be two fields that are available to you, okay? So I'm going to show you how that works. If I go back into this book data set, and I'm actually going to break this information table because this is actually pre-configured to show off this particular capability that joins can do, but relationships can't do. Which is if I look at the information table here, you'll see that I've got a field which is book ID 1 and book ID 2, which are essentially the two fields before they've been concatenated. Now, I can't write a calculation to create I can't write a calculation, then use that in the relationship. Only a join calc can actually do that. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So let's just drag info here. When I drop it in, Tableau will automatically use the book ID, and I don't want to do that. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to say book ID on the left-hand side, which is correct, and do a left join here. And on the right-hand side, if I click on this drop-down, you'll see here, I don't know why it's tiny, but it says a create a join calculation in the smallest font I've ever seen. I don't know why it's just not the same size, but if you click on that, you actually get this view that allows you to create a calculation that you can then use to do a join. So if I select book ID 1 and then plus book ID 2, okay, this essentially concatenates the fields because these are two string fields. If I click OK, then now that join relationship works, and you can see here that it's worked. Okay, it's done exactly that. You can only do that with a join. So if you need to do any sort of join calculations, do them in this setup in the physical layer, and then you can use whatever field you sort of brought in with a join calculation in a relationship elsewhere. Okay, so that's how to basically solve that particular problem. If you're working with that. I think this is, again, the first iteration of this. So I no doubt this is going to improve over time. Let's go to some next question. You mentioned impact on number of records. What is the impact on published content when you upgrade? So I think I covered this before, but essentially anything that you've already built in previous versions of Tableau will get a new table that simply says migrated data source. And that's essentially going to preserve things like number of records and any sort of calculations that you did. Now, I have to say, in doing this, when you've got really complicated workbooks and you do anything like refresh data, you might get this weird behavior where Tableau forgets things like metadata behind that particular field. So it's just one to check before you automatically upgrade to 2020.2. Just check the performance on your most complex, your mediums and your basic workbooks, just to see the impact and whether you do need to go in and tweak a few things upfront in 2022 before publishing them back up, or potentially waiting for bugs and things to be fixed. That's typically a good idea generally. Never hop straight on to day one of a product, because you're essentially going to be beta testing bugs if they weren't spotted in the beta test itself. Okay. Let's look down at some of these comments. Including empty dimension members will be handy for specific customer issue I have. Great, that's good to know. The thing to bear in mind here, and I think it's worth noting, if you come from the Power BI or Click world, you'll actually think that this version of the data model is quite basic, and that's because those products have a more advanced sort of way of connecting these data sets and relationships together. It's not fully sort of there yet. But if you go to the documentation that I highlighted, I'll put them in the description, and I'll also highlight them again. Maybe I'll just pull them up if I can find my browser. Let's just pull those up. There's actually a really good article that explains, what you can't do and what you can do, and how all of this impacts sort of your typical day-to-day. I think it's actually this page here, which at the very bottom, once you've gone through the description of what's going on, does some very important information about the differences between relationships and joins. It also has some differences between relationships and blends. To be honest with you, I read these myself, and I think it's the kind of thing that you can only really understand when you come across an example. So just have the documentation at hand and be aware that that's probably a better way of sort of troubleshooting some of these issues. They also have a really good guide that explains when to use relationships, when to use joins, when to use unions, and when to use blends. I'm going to go through this in a second before I close off the live stream. But essentially, this is a great document to go to. You can't miss it if you go to the What's New in Tableau pages, and Tableau linked to this page multiple times, even inside of the product. If I just go to open this particular connection, you'll see here I get this little information icon, and when I click on that, it actually opens this description page, the home page for the documentation. So you can get right there from inside of the product, and it's something I recommend. You maybe don't read end to end, but you maybe just start to understand some of the sort of limitations and how it works compared to other products maybe that have had this feature for some time. Okay. A couple of other questions. I think Juan asks, in my opinion, what would be the key to decide if you should proceed with left joins in the physical layer or use the logical layer? Is it only performance? I think fundamentally, what you should do is, unless you need to use a join for a specific use case, for example, the join calculation is a good example where I needed to specifically do something so that I could have a relationship in another logical table to be made possible. That's a good example. In other cases, obviously, I've just highlighted this documentation that describes, when to use these, and it's actually quite specific. And what Tableau generally have said about this feature is that it should actually be more intuitive to just use relationships in most cases until you come across something that you can't do with relationships, at which point you can then default to a join and then default to a blend. Now, the advantage with relationships in most cases actually is going to be that you can generally get away with doing more than you typically were able to. So it should actually be easier to work with data sets, not harder, if that makes sense. So my advice generally is carry on as you are, use relationships instead of joins, as you see fit. But when you come across a hurdle that can't be solved using relationships, then revert back to joins and blends. But primarily, the default is now relationships. So just try and sort of work around that and work with that the best you can. Okay. Cool. So Monica has highlighted that calculated measures appear in the bottom. This is probably where I went wrong myself. Maybe I got that fact incorrect. So what Monica is highlighting here is the fact that when I created a concatenated field with the authors, this dimension actually appeared here at the top. But when I actually created any calculated measure, it automatically goes here to the bottom, even though it all came from one logical table. So maybe that's a particular detail that I didn't quite spot, or haven't really clocked, even though I've been using this for a couple of months, which is in itself a highlight that you're going to need to use this quite a lot to get comfortable with the feature. Can you combine a union with a join in the physical layer? That's a good question. So let's have a look at that very quickly. So if we go into the physical layer, there's no reason why I can't. I can still drag a new union in here and specify the different bits of information here. And when I click OK, it's going to sort of start crying because it doesn't understand how that union should work. So you absolutely can use a union inside of this physical layer if you needed to. You haven't lost any capability. Anything you could have done before, you should still be able to do in this physical layer. Okay. The difference is that when you're working in this physical layer, you are restricting the kind of questions you can answer at the higher level. So where possible, try and default to relationships pretty much. Okay. This particular join isn't going to make sense because I haven't got any common information that I can use to join this union, but essentially it's possible. So that should be fine. Okay. How do relationships, so this is a question from Charlie, how do relationships work with data extracts? E.g., if you publish the Tableau server, I'm guessing it publishes each individual physical table, but includes knowledge of the defined relationship. Absolutely. So let's have a go at doing that right now. You can see here I've got this single data source. If I go to do an extract, as I have done before, you'll notice something important. At the very top, you get this option to do a logical table extract, okay? And this is a sneaky feature that has actually existed for some time, in that before 2020.2, it actually was able to do multi-table extract. So that was like a precursor to this. Essentially what it does is it keeps the table separate, and then in the query, it actually dynamically does the relationship and manages it. And so when you publish this up to Tableau server, you absolutely are publishing multiple logical tables with any physical tables inside of those, and then the relationship that defines how that works, which means it can be used in the published data source. And more importantly, things like Arts data and other features can also use that. So this is really important because a blend, you can't do that with a blend. In a blend, the user has to download the two data sets and define the relationship themselves in the view itself. Whereas here, you can define that across the data set, a relationship across the data set, then the user can decide what perspective they want to use. Okay, so that's a really important sort of piece of context to be aware of. Okay. Another question from Charlie. Also, within views which use related data sources, are there any limitations of what calculation functions you can use, e.g. with blending where you can't use count distinct? Now, there are a few of these. I haven't worked I haven't worked at all with 2020.2 in a customer situation where I've had to do a complex join. As it is with new products and new features, it takes a while for people to actually start using them. But I do anticipate there will be some limitations, especially in cases where you're maybe the relationship doesn't allow it. But again, the point here is that you should need to do that less with relationships, because you're actually at each sort of visualization, the level of detail of the visualization, you're actually giving Tableau the capability to decide the level of aggregation and therefore make it easier to do those aggregations at the correct level, number one. Number two, you don't have to use LODs to fix those. And then number three, you're flexible you're flexible because any perspective you want can all be done off one connection. You don't have to create multiple connections to do sort of multiple jobs, if that makes sense. So it should be easier, if that makes sense. Will this data model help with extracting millions of rows more smoothly? That's a good question. I think what it will do is it will improve performance in instances where you needed to join lots of physical tables to itself. So essentially, a typical example is where you have user permissions inside of the data sets, right? So you join a user to every single row they're supposed to be able to see, and it just does this thing where it explodes the data set to like ridiculous levels. In 2019.2, they actually introduced a multi-table extract, so that actually wasn't necessary. You could just publish up a list of users, and you publish up your data set with information in the columns about what a user could see. And then in query time, Tableau would dynamically query the data and create a view that was suitable for the user. So that avoided this instance where you had one single really large data set, and actually increased the performance considerably in those examples. In other examples where you're defining the relationship, it should also improve performance, because what's not happening is it's not querying the entire data set. It's only querying the relevant fields that are required in the specific view. So you should still notice the performance improvement in those cases as well. How big a performance improvement? It really depends on the size of your data and the size of the extract or whatever you're working with. In this book case example, you're not going to really notice the difference because it's such a small data set that most of it can be done in memory quite comfortably. But again, it's something you have to explore with your own individual data sets. Okay. Do you have relations example based on the basic data models accompanying Tableau, like Superstore or World Indicators? So absolutely. So if you, I think this question comes from two places. Number one, I'll put this data set in the description of this video so you can download it and try it yourself. I think it's a really good one because it's a little bit more robust and sort of complicated compared to Superstore. But absolutely, if I open up 2020.2, and I just connect to let's try and connect to the default workbook here. So I think I have to go to my documents, go to my Tableau repository, not my Tableau prep repository, my Tableau repository, go to data sources, go into 2020.2 and open up the Superstore sales Excel file. I think they have deliberately changed the Excel file so you can actually work with, no, they haven't done that at all. I thought they had managers. I think I saw a demo where there was a version of Superstore sales where they had a few more bits of information that you could work with, but you could still do this here. For example, if I bring in orders, okay, I can bring in returns and simply relate them using the order ID. And I can bring in the people. I think I brought the orders in again there. I don't want to bring itself back in. I don't think there's anything stopping you doing that. I think it doesn't make sense in this case. I'm trying to bring in people here. And then, yeah, again, it's just join this on region and then I can just hop straight into my data set, and I could say, well, let's see how performance by individual person. So let's see who is selling the most goods, right? A very simple question, and it's automatically sort of figured out the relationships there. So it's very simple. I don't see any sort of issue with doing that in the traditional sense with the data source. Data source filters. This is a question from Monica. Filters the specific table. How does it work? So data source filter is actually going to do a couple of interesting things. So let's go back to my book data set. Now, if I edit data source filter and I click add, you'll see that I just get the dimensions, but it's across the whole entire data set. Okay, so if I filter out something at a specific level, let's say I filter out an author, let's just do this by author name, okay, and click OK. And remember, this is my calculated field that I created. What it's actually doing, if I just, let's say I just pick 3, specifically choose someone who doesn't have a book as well. And a lot of these people beginning with A don't have books, so let's choose some beginning with B and C, click OK. What it's doing is it's actually going into the data set and it's looking at the relationships, and it's only pulling in the information that relates to that author. Okay, so if I bring in the titles, you'll notice that I now only have titles from the authors that I had before. So let's just expand this a little bit. Something funny happened as well. I don't know if you noticed this. If I go back, you'll notice Amelia to Arturo, these 3 don't have any books, okay? But if I go forward, you'll notice that they completely disappear from my data set, okay? So you're probably wondering, well, what's going on? If I go to analysis and I show empty rows, they come back, okay? So you might do this analysis and you might think, okay, well, what happens in that particular case? You need to make sure that you show empty rows or empty columns in whatever data set you're working with to be able to see the things that have been excluded because they didn't have a match. So in this case, these guys don't have a book, so that's null. But you can see here they're authors, but otherwise everything else is coming in. So it's using my author table, looking at the relationships, going all the way through, and then pulling out the relevant information related to that particular author at the point of the query. It's not actually excluding it from the data set, although a data source filter does that. At the point of query, it's excluding that information from the view. And I can even drag something like the publishing house, which isn't directly related to the author, and it's still correctly grabbing the correct publishing house. Okay. So that's pretty much it. It's a little bit past 5 o'clock. This is supposed to last an hour, but it's overrun a little bit. The last question here is from Chaitana. How does this help for using custom SQL? If you've already defined the relationship. Okay, interesting question. So I don't think I understand this question fully. How does this help if you're using custom SQL and you're already defining relationship? I guess if you're using custom SQL already, maybe this is a use case where you don't have to use that as much. But ultimately, if you're in, I'm using Excel here, so this doesn't work. But if I go into this physical layer here, it kind of depends on, I guess, your workflow of how you connect the view. If you're using custom SQL, then you could just directly connect to the table. You don't need to worry too much about all of this. And you can just bring in whatever view or whatever perspective that you're looking to do. Because I'm using the modern Excel connector here, I'm only seeing the, I'm not seeing the kind of Excel custom SQL capability that you typically get here. But the other thing to bear in mind is if you check the documentation, some data types, some database types, and specifically database types like cubes aren't supported with the data model just yet. So you need to be aware that this doesn't just work out of the box with everything. There are some edge cases where it's worth checking if this works. Okay, again, just test the product. Show empty row / column. Is it at sheet level? Absolutely. So everything in the relationship is going to be at the specific level that you're at the specific sheet or view that you're looking at, because a very simple reason. each view has its own query to the data source. There's no global query anymore like you used to have in previous versions. And so that makes, each view faster, but that means each view has its own level of detail. But at the same time, if you're doing things like creating actions and links and filters across multiple data sets, those are still going to work because those filters are going to just go off to each view and be applied, just like we applied the data source filter here. And you saw that it's only keeping the relevant authors, okay? So these options are specific to the view, but typically if you're filtering more broadly, those filters should just work as you've expected. So again, this should be more intuitive. It shouldn't be a harder thing to use. Okay. Right, I'm gonna bring this live stream to a close now. I'm just going to call out again the documentation from Tableau. It's a really, really good set of documentation. It explains very clearly when you should use joins, relationships, and blends in a really, really clear way. Again, I highly encourage you to start playing around with the product. You're not going to encounter all the use cases that you can typically think of off the top of your head until you actually just start using it. So open some old workbooks with the product and just see where you end up. Okay. Right. To close off, I'm just going to call out next week's event. So next week, I'll be back here again Wednesday, exactly the same time. And I'll be talking about some of the other broad features in Tableau Desktop. I must admit, today's live stream was a little bit dense and heavy. There's lots to go through. I'm never one to kind of fill a stream with really sometimes dry content. So join in next week. We're going to be looking at a lot more sort of interesting desktop features, new items, things like set actions, and even things like metrics, which is actually not a desktop feature, but we'll cover it as well when we look at server in the future. And then the very last stream, we'll look at Tableau prep and data management. Okay, so thank you very much for joining the stream. Thanks for watching. It's been a great audience, really interactive sort of set of questions, really challenging questions as well. I must admit, I don't feel as prepared as I was having gone through those questions. So props to everyone who asked great questions, and thanks for getting involved. I hope to catch you next week when you join in. Thank you for watching. Catch this video later on when it's live on the channel. Okay, thank you very much.